topic today, as you know, is challenges to the viability of international agreements on chemical and biological weapons. This is going to be, of course, a timely and very interesting discussion, and thank you all for joining us. Before introducing our speakers and reviewing the protocol, let me review a little bit of what brings us here today. Two of the most important arms control legacies of the 20th century face uncertain prospects in the 21st century. The Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention was created at the height of the Cold War. It built on the foundation of the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which banned the use but not the possession of biological and bacteriological and chemical weapons. The decision to create the treaty regime and of the possessors of biological weapons to abandon them reflected a broad skepticism about the military utility of biological warfare agents, but it also reflected confidence in the utility of nuclear deterrence and protective measures to negate the risks that might come in a disarmed world. And the Biological Weapons Convention entered into force in 1975. The Chemical Weapons Convention became possible only at the end of the Cold War, and it entered into force in 1997. The longer time that it took to build this part of the legacy of the Geneva Protocol had something to do with a higher perceived military utility to chemical weapons and a confidence or a value in so-called in-kind deterrence. Chemical weapons deterrence was generally seen as a problem for which nuclear deterrence was not particularly effective. The creation of the Chemical Weapons Convention also had something to do with George H.W. Bush's mother. For those who don't know this story, George H.W. Bush, in his role as vice president, cast but one vote to break a tie in the United States Senate, and that was for the production of binary chemical weapons. And at the end of the day, his mother called him and said, "George, what are you doing? How could you be in favor of chemical weapons?" And he said, "Well, I'm basically creating bargaining chips, and I will ensure that we have an arms control process and an arms control result." And this was something to which he attached personal priority as president a few years later, when, of course, the international landscape had changed considerably. The subsequent ratification debate about the Chemical Weapons Convention became, in retrospect, an opening chapter in the saga of the changing domestic politics of arms control, as a treaty negotiated and signed by a Republican president and administration garnered significant opposition just a few years later from a Republican Senate. Now, in the intervening decades, these treaties have attracted at most episodic political attention. We've put our focus elsewhere as an arms control community and a technical community. But periodic review conferences of states parties to both treaties have struggled with multiple concerns about compliance and about various failures of the implementing bodies and/or the United Nations Security Council to restore compliance. They've also struggled with questions about how to ensure that the treaties and the treaty regimes, the implementation regimes, remain well aligned with technical realities. And of course, the technical realities in the chemical and biological domains are very dynamic. Thus, it's hardly surprising that in this time of a pandemic, we find a sharpened interest in these questions about the future of these regimes as part of a broader national and international discussion of how best to ensure our public safety and security in the current period. The Department of Defense is, of course, a stakeholder in the effectiveness of these treaties. Whether or not it should expect to see chemical or biological agents on the battlefield is a critical factor in military planning. Faced with growing concerns about the future viability of these treaties, Department of Defense leadership turned to its Threat Reduction Advisory Committee, chaired by Livermore's own Ron Lehman, for advice. And the TRAC convened a task force under the leadership of two of its members, Dr. Mim John and Dr. David Franz, who are with us today. And they will report on the findings of this task force and some of the implementation activities. Let me briefly introduce both of them. Dr. John is well known to the lab community, of course, given her long career at that other laboratory across the street, culminating in her role as leader of its California operation. She serves as vice chair of the Threat Reduction Advisory Committee, as a member of the Defense Science Board and of the Naval Studies Board, as a director of the Leidos Corporation and MIT's Lincoln Lab, and she served previously as chair of the California Council of Science and Technology. Dr. Franz served for 27 years in the U.S. Army Medical Research and Materiel Command and retired as a colonel. We first met more decades ago than we would care to count when he was serving as commander of the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute on Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and of its Committee on International Security and Arms Control. He's a member of the National Research Council Board's, the National Research Council's Board on Life Sciences. He's a member of the Department of Health and Human Services National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity. Interestingly, he also did three tours as chief inspector on UNSCOM biological inspection missions to Iraq. That's the United Nations Special Commission on Iraq. Our rules of engagement today, let me reiterate, we are on the record. The two speakers will present for 30 to 45 minutes or so, but leaving plenty of time for Q&A. If you'd like to join the discussion after their presentations, please use the chat function. And when you use the chat function, you'll have to select to whom your message is going, and it should go to all panelists. That way, I will see it. I'm not the host. If you send it to the host, Katie Thomas will see it. Please send to all panelists, and I will keep the conversation going by lifting questions from the queue. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Mim and Dave, for taking the time out of busy schedules to bring us up to speed on this work. Over to you.
Great. Thanks, Brad. That was quite an introduction and a hard act for us to follow because I think we thought we needed to offer a number of disclaimers right up front. The first being that we did this work before COVID broke. And as Dave and I have reviewed it, there's certainly a number of points that we bring up, not so much our findings as to their accuracy, but rather the recommendations we would make in the current context. But we're not going to speculate because we haven't done our homework to understand in particular how DoD behaved and found issues during this its response to the pandemic. The other thing is that we did this in the context of what it meant to DoD. There are much bigger questions about what the treaties mean in the large with respect to our overall national security and the shoring up of international norms. But the questions posed to us really were about we're seeing increased use, so what does this mean to DoD? So Katie, if you can bring up the first chart, the title chart. Let's see, and I'll start this. Dave is gonna be the color guy throughout this because he's got all kinds of relevant and interesting experiences to share along the way. The report is available, but you'll need to contact me or Dave or Ron Lehman because the TRAC itself was disbanded at the end of December in a move directed by the White House to the department to shrink the number of federal advisory committees that it had. So we don't have a website where we post it anymore. We're looking into whether we can bring these up on the Defense Science Board website. Hope that'll happen. But in the meantime, if you want to copy the report, let us know. Next chart, please, Katie. So we have a 2-page terms of reference, but in effect, it's saying what's the impact of the worrisome use of chemical weapons and the advances in biotechnology as we look forward, and the impact especially on the Department of Defense. Next chart, please. We want to start with a shout out to the people who worked on this, a pretty impressive group of TRAC members with Ken, Melissa, Gigi, Susan, Ron was a participant, and George Whitesides. And we had a very good group of advisors as well. And I believe Mike Haynes is listening in from policy. Next chart, please. Brad's already talked about this first part about, you know, the history of the treaties and what their high-level provisions are. The real issues are that in today's world, as we look at things that could never be anticipated with respect to the advances in the biological sciences, are really bringing into question what's in and what's out of the treaty, at least in the minds of some of the signatories. With respect to chemical, of course, we've seen the use of chemicals in interesting and very concerning ways, with apparently little repercussion and the like. Does that mean that the gates are now open for indiscriminate use against us in any sort of security engagement that we find ourselves in? The notion that you could go back and look at the treaties and try to shore them up, everybody we heard from said that's probably a non-starter, that there's just not going to be an appetite to open up the discussion. But what can happen is around each of the review conferences for the treaties that working groups get formed and things inch forward to either expand interpretations or update interpretations of the treaties, and or in the case of the Chemical Weapons Convention, where there's a lot of specificity as to what's in and what's out and how they're handled, to start to bring in some of the newer, unexpected chemicals that are being used as weapons, like fentanyls, into the discussion and prohibition at levels that support much more intrusive inspections. The next chart, please. So, what does this mean to DoD? DoD has some roles in supporting the treaties, mostly with compliance and the like. So that's not going away. There's a pretty active group, the Compliance Review Group, that reviews activities within the R&D community of DoD and the acquisition community of DoD to make sure that whatever they're doing is within the letter of the law. But the real issue is as it comes to DoD, moves beyond the treaties, and that's in fact where we went with this study. So, with all due apologies to many of you out there who've heard both Dave and I talk about this in the past. You're going to see some of the same themes pop up when it comes to what do we do about chemical and biological threats going forward. The fact is that as I said earlier, things that are happening today in the technical world could not have been envisioned when the treaties were written. So it brings into question whether strategies and approaches built on those old assumptions really make sense anymore. And to our way of thinking, we ended up saying, no, it doesn't. And in fact, we really need to take a hard look at revamping the whole approach to dealing with either chemical or biological threats in the future. The next chart, please. Okay, finding number one. You all know this. We're not going to be able to talk about the threat in depth, but given that, we all are aware of what's happened in Syria over many years now. And of course, Russia gave us a nice surprise a couple of years ago when they came out of the closet, so to speak, and using a Novichok agent in the Skripal event in the UK. And it's pretty well known that things back to the neutralization of the terrorists in the Opera House, that fentanyls had been used in that case. And the commerce in fentanyls is quite worrisome. With respect to biology, that's a different issue, and it's got to do with where technology is going. And what's been true from the start, namely the inability to distinguish legitimate from illegitimate work. It appears that that the crossover, the taboo, has yet to be broken, but we can expect to be surprised. And we base that sentence, that comment, on some of the threat information that we were able to look at. Just things that are bubbling up that should give everyone a fair amount of concern. Dave makes a good point on the last bullets. Dave, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, thank you, Mim. And thanks, Brad, for the introduction. Many of us have long talked about the similarities in presentation, in response, and even preparation for intentional versus natural ID events. And I think it's pretty well accepted now that they are very similar. Until the late 90s, our service labs were funded to work on both, really intentional and threats. At USAMRIID, for example, it was the Soviet weaponized agents, the Dirty Dozen, we called them, but also the high containment, the viruses requiring high containment, Ebola, Lassa, Congo Crimean hemorrhagic fever, Korean hemorrhagic fever, and so on. So we were always able to practice for BW, which was our core mission, on natural outbreaks. And we set up collaborations in Africa and Southeast Asia, and even in the Middle East at times. And we also had, within DOD, an amazing string of OCONUS labs, the NAMRUs, the Navy labs, the USAMRUs, and then, of course, AFRAMs in Bangkok. And what this all allowed us to do was to develop SMEs who were comfortable with these high containment requiring infectious disease pathogens. Later in the story here, we'll talk about how that has changed. But I think at this point, and by including what we've learned during the pandemic, we can come close to saying that certainly it's most efficient to have one set of humans and physical assets and leadership working both sides of this this program, intentional and natural. We may have already proven that in the post-Cold War that it's very, very difficult or maybe impossible to sustain a program that is siloed for just intentional threat agents.
And see if I can pile onto what Dave said. A couple of things. What happened in the department in the 90s was legislation that fenced the money for chemical and biological defense, and put that first with the Army and subsequently with acquisition and sustainment in the department. And anything else fell under the purview of health affairs. So the split was made as opposed to understanding that it was the fundamental technical needs for addressing either one were very much the same, and all. Let's see. Let's go to the next chart. You can go back to Dave. You'll have to trust us on this one. This was we had to pull out all of the juicy information to be able to talk about the who's doing it, what are they doing, and what are they looking at. But Dave had an interesting encounter about 10 years ago that speaks worlds to what we're facing today.
Just an anecdote, as was mentioned, I've been working with the academies for a number of years, and we started in 2007 in China. And for the first years, it was just, I'd almost call it busy work, just trying to make friends, until I got Jim LeDuc involved, and he brought the science in his lab, and then the Chinese scientists at the academies became much more interested in our work. But during that slow period, my point of contact was a fairly senior gentleman who was responsible for the biotechnology pillar of the 5-year plan. And we used to meet at my hotel every time I was in town. We'd have lunch or we'd have coffee or whatever, and just learning to know one another. And at one point he said this: the Europeans won the Industrial Revolution. You Americans won the IT revolution. We will win the biotech revolution. And I thought that was telling, and certainly it's clear they've been working on it ever since.
Right. It also speaks to their persistence and commitment to the long term. So that was already a part of their planning, and certainly we're seeing the evidence of those efforts emerging today. Next chart, please. Okay, so the first was that people are starting to use these things, and we're worried about it because it's very hard to figure that out ahead of time, given the level of resources that are devoted to that today. But what makes it even harder is trying to figure out what indeed is an agent today, because our focus during the Cold War on what the Soviets were working on has given way to different families, different classes of things that can be applied in malicious ways. It includes engineered pathogens that would be resistant to particular medical countermeasures that we were counting on. It would include biologicals that would compromise immunity, neurological functions, as we've seen on the chemical side, the misuse of pharma in the way of opioids, and so on. And of course, everybody's big bugaboo of a problem of what if we start to actually engineer key human functions and or maybe even more worrisome, attack agricultural targets. So start to starve populations. Then we've got this crossover of chemicals that are now manufactured from biologicals, biologicals being manufactured from chemicals, and adding complexity to any sort of verification regimes associated with the treaties. And when do you get worried? lots of questions about when do you make the call that something is no longer acceptable within the context of the treaties. Next chart, please.
So data, excuse me, data as a strategic asset. Certainly some of the other task force members are better equipped to explain this than I am, but I'm sure you're all familiar. We do have adversaries, certainly the great powers, interested in genomics and genotype-phenotype relationships, not only for microbes, as we might be, but also for humans. Actually, as late as this week, there was a story on China doing genetic mapping of men and boys on a very large scale. And, you know, this data could be used for health-related studies, but it could also be used for surveillance and for tracking. So we're certainly seeing the merging of biotech and cyber tech, and have been already for years, and are aware that there are real and potential compromise of software systems and data. And I'm not sure we know exactly where all of this might lead, but you can imagine impact on facilities and processes, information systems, harmful use of genomics, data analytics, even electronic health records. Again, just in the media this week, there was a piece about, as we know, a few years ago, BGI was buying up all of the Illumina sequencers they could get their hands on. And recently, as late as, I think it was last week, Illumina placed preliminary injunctions against BGI for selling sequencing platforms, their own now sequencing platforms in the United States. So the task force certainly believes, I think it's fair to say, that we need to have good people doing some good thinking about these issues of data as a strategic asset.
And just to pile on to what Dave said, that last bullet's really important. If you start to look in the Department of Defense for expertise that could start to understand what all this means, you're going to be hard pressed to find them. There's certainly plenty of medical professionals who are working the, if you will, the normal baseline health issues in the department. But the number of people who worry about where things are going and what threats those present is really, really pretty few and far between. Next chart, please. We then, you know, after we got a pretty good handle on the external environment, which was concerning enough, we turned our sights onto, well, has anything changed in DoD in the 3 or 4 years since the last time we looked at this in any depth? I'd say the answer to that was no, maybe it's gotten a little worse. Certainly, we heard one positive that we went into the study thinking might be a problem. The treaties and their implementing legislation prohibit a lot of activities. You'd say, well, that doesn't seem to be slowing down Russia or China or some others. But in digging into that, it appeared, as we talked to the research community and to the compliance review group, that in almost every case, we found a way around issues to allow the R&D to continue and to allow acquisition to proceed, all within, you know, fairly conservative interpretations of what the treaties allow. More significant, I think, was the regulatory environment that people have to operate in now. And Dave is much better acquainted with that now. But I think those of you in the DOE audience will be quite sympathetic to what that means. Dave, and talk a little bit about that.
Mim. Under creeping domestic regulation, in the old days, when I actually got started at RID in '87, we had the CDC's guidelines, and these are guidelines, not regulations, the BMBL, we called it the Bible. They were our guidelines. The director or the commander of the organization was responsible and had the authority to implement them. And then after 9/11 and 10/4, we layered additional real regulations on them. First in 97, the Select Agent Program, which wasn't too onerous. And then in 03, a Select Agent Program with real teeth in it. 08, AR 50-1, an Army regulation for surety. And many of you in the audience will know what that means. I actually was telling Mim yesterday that I wrote an op-ed entitled The Nuclearization of Biology. And what AR 50-1 gave us was biosafety, which we all love, biosecurity, which we don't mind, agent accountability, which is impossible, and personal reliability, which is just takes some time and some FTEs out of an organization. And then in 2012, after some issues with H5N1, we had gain of function layered over that. And then finally, when there were some accidents at the CDC, not causing disease, but someone less than careful with bugs, and at Dugway, the shipments of some virulent anthrax spores to other labs. Then we layered on what was called the White House pause that stopped a lot of gain of function work, much of which was on coronaviruses at the time, and that was later opened up. But one of our senior leaders in the Pentagon told us while we were on the task force that, this is at one of the labs, that inspectors in the building 100 days per year wasn't unusual. So in those 30 years, we have certainly layered on a lot of regulations. We know how to measure efficacy of these things for safety. I don't know how to measure, I don't know the metrics for whether they've made us more secure.
Sounds familiar. Let's see. We got concerned as we dug into, the nature of the work going on at the laboratories within DoD, where most of the expertise lies, at how little innovation was able to blossom under partly the regulations, but also partly the way the program itself, the principal funding for the program coming from the ChemBio defense program, how much overhead there was associated programmatically with what were very small projects. That if you really wanted to find sources of innovation, particularly in biotechnology, you had to go to DARPA. And with DARPA, it's hit or miss as to what makes a transition or not. DITRA was paying attention to the DARPA program and picked up some things, but quite a bit of it was left to go out in the world and make its own way in a commercial environment. I think that those of us who've grown up in the NNSA understand the importance of the laboratories. And Dave himself understands the importance of what the laboratories could do back in the Cold War when they were supported. You want to say anything more about that, Dave?
Yeah, we often talk about the idea of our service labs as being an insurance policy for the nation for times when the balloon goes up. And I think with regard, at least to our bio service lab, we've demonstrated, or we can observe in the last 6 months, that we just haven't been paying our insurance premiums over the preceding years. One of the issues, and I think this is listed in that last part of that second last sub-bullet, is with regard to the advanced development and the challenges and the problems we've had in DoD with advanced development medical countermeasures. And actually, it's a long and painful story we can't get into here, but I think it's part of the cause of the micromanagement. Someone above us was saying, oh, you've got to do better than that. It can't take that long to get a vaccine into the arms of soldiers, and so on. And I think that has been a component in the micromanagement that has resulted over the last 20 years as well. But now, as we have data from BARDA to compare with DOD's transitions, it's become pretty obvious. And the bottom line that the task force, I think, drew was that DOD has not understood the level of investment that it takes to get medical countermeasures to the force.
Yeah.
Ma'am, may I just jump in for a moment? We're getting an echo effect back through the system. So when one of you is speaking, if the other would mute, that would help manage that echo effect. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks for the feedback. All right, so Dave, you mute, and I'll speak to this one for a little bit. All right, let's go to the next chart, Katie. The other thing, and this is not going to be new to those of you who've heard me in particular speak in the past about the way the program's organized. It's split between the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Army, the Joint Staff. Each one has their own bureaucracy, and they don't always play well together. And for the size of the program, at a couple of $1 billion, give or take some change, it is one of the highest overhead programs that at least I've looked at in my 20-something years of looking at programs there. Another thing that plagues the program is the fact that the collection of requirements is typically a survey with the combatant commanders who don't have the on-roll expertise to understand what they really need and what kind of threat they might be facing. And so the context for them is, give me some stuff. So they end up focusing on material solutions, protective gear, and the like, without understanding how the interplay with operational approaches should be made, because they don't practice for these kinds of events. We've talked about, Dave just talked about the unrealistic resource allocation for medical countermeasures. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Dave, but the fact is you need to be in the game for quite some time. And it just takes time because of the way animals react and the way the human body reacts when exposed to viruses or bacteria or whatever that you're trying to guard against. And finally, I just say that if you talk to other players in the game at HHS, at the National Security Council, at the State Department with respect to the treaties, they're talking to different people in the department and they're getting different messages. So there's no coordination for the department to go forward with one voice. And whether that's through a single person or whether it's through some leader in the department that gives everybody the same messages to convey, we leave that up to them, but there just needs to be a single coordinating point of action, person in the organization that just today doesn't exist. Dave?
Yeah. The other issue that I don't think they mentioned was that MRDC, in the case of ICD and RID, MRDC owns the people and the facilities, and ASD-NCB, I think it's still called that, maybe not, owns the program, which is run through S&T at DITRA, JRO for requirements, and JPEO for advanced development. So it's kind of a cobbled together program, and the sort of creeping micromanagement that has come from inside or right outside the Beltway began really shortly after I retired in '98, to the point where eventually 20 years later, the commanders of these two labs are probably more building managers than they are commanders, and scientists in the labs have become performers rather than part of teams of a culture of an organization. And that's a term that is used essentially officially by the folks that run the programs from inside the Pentagon. So rather than thinking about organizational health and culture and mentoring and happy scientists and SMEs, we're talking about treating these people more as individuals, like you would deal with academia and industry. And yet they are and traditionally have been our service labs. They become orphans.
Yeah. Let's see, to translate some of Dave's alphabet soup, there are parts of the Army that own the facilities and are responsible for investing, but they have no control over the programmatics at those facilities. The scientists in the laboratories are dependent on, if you will, competing for work with some of you all, as a matter of fact, at the DOE laboratories, as well as the commercial sector, largely through DITRA, a little bit through DARPA, and all with no base funding on their own. So imagine, if you will, that Lawrence Livermore did not have the baseline of the nuclear weapons program and was all on its own, had no source of IRAD even to work. So it starts to look more like a commercial company, and you get that devolution into everybody working for food. Next chart, please. So what are we going to do about all of this? Okay, the first thing we said was, hey, look, the strategy's got to change. And we said this earlier. Those of you who've heard some of us speak about some Defense Science Board work we did on WMD deterrence, and that part of it that addressed the chemical and biological threats, this will be familiar. We really are talking about defense in depth. And we're saying that in this context, the mantra of protect the warfighter, which has been the guiding principle for decades, has got to give way to a much more comprehensive set of objectives, because the targets in the future are not going to be just the warfighter. And we are already seeing that with cyber operations. There's no reason to think that chemical or biological operations won't mimic that as well. So with that in mind, we want to look, what can we do more effectively upstream, and what can we do more effectively downstream as well. The next chart, please. So this just lays the groundwork for putting the pieces together. We know that there's no single step that we could take that would put any of these threats to bed. So we're going to have to layer our defense, and we're going to have to make each step introduce risk into the mind of the attacker, such that in total, the attacker is deterred from ever going there. And the next chart really encapsulates that. Let's go to the next chart, Katie, where we benefited from a really terrific discussion with Julie Benz, recently retired Major General out of the Army National Guard, Julie was at the White House at the time, struggling with how to build a strategy around a larger set of WMD issues. And we took what she was working with and tailored it to our problem of, okay, if we're going to do this comprehensively, we've got to move beyond that little yellow box there where we've hung our hats in most of our activities and start to look more comprehensively, not unlike we do in the nuclear world, not unlike we do in conventional warfighting operations. It starts with understanding that foundational to all of this is a comprehensive strategy, appropriate governance structures, support for a dedicated workforce, and the sustained level of funding that needs to go along with that. Once you have that, you can start to get smarter about the problem. And certainly we're going to be challenged to do that when we said earlier, it's so hard to tell legitimate from illegitimate activities. So in addition to intelligence, we really need to have much more in the way of, if you will, personal diplomacy, of which Dave is a terrific example of how to make that work. We have to understand and learn from our gaming and exercise regimens by introducing the potential use of these weapons, and with that, everybody, just like we've argued for in the nuclear regime for years and years, everybody needs some very basic 101 level of education about what these weapons mean and what are the basic things one does when confronted with the possibility of their use. Then there's, of course, the stuff you invest in, okay? You invest in strengthening the treaties. You invest in elimination, interdiction elimination, where you can preclude their use. Of course, DPRK being a really good example of that. And you invest in the defensive measures that most of us who've worked in this area have focused our attention for the last few decades. And there's no substitute in this area for partnerships because of how fast the technology is moving in the biological area, because of the distribution of capabilities and responsibilities across the government. The interagency is tremendously important. And because of the fact that we want to make sure that the treaties remain as strong as they possibly can. We need to be active and interested and informed players in that regime. So with that strategy in mind, I'm going to suggest that on the next few charts, what we did was go through each one of those steps and say, okay, what are the things that are most important to do? We ended up with an almost, if you were confronted with this on day one of your job, given the responsibility, you'd be a bit overwhelmed. So we took all of those and said, all right, here's your get started recommendations for what we would do if we were in your place. But some high points with respect to policy and strategy. Much like the nuclear posture review is undertaken periodically at the beginning of a new administration, there's never been something like that in the chemical and or biological area. We would recommend that that take place. That would help get at identifying the issues with governance and management, the next piece, which is where we really would like to see some consolidation of leadership in the department so that the department is clear on its interfaces outside of the department and it speaks with one voice. Foundational, of course, is the workforce, and Dave's can cover that much better than I can because he's been there, done that.
Thanks, Mim. Yes, from my perspective, it's all about workforce. As I mentioned, SMEs are absolutely critical to everything that goes on in an organization. And there's a long and messy list of reasons why we've lost SMEs like we have, particularly in our bioservice lab. But I just know less about ICD. But leadership has been a major issue. Mission lag. The mission should have changed after we left the Cold War, but it's been very slow in evolving. The micromanagement I mentioned, morale after the anthrax letters, and particularly after Bruce Ivan's death, hyperregulation of the select agents, an orphan within MRDC, as I said, because they just own the building and the people, an orphan in DOD. There's been one bright spot as MRDC has transitioned to the Army Futures Command in the last year. General John Murray, the commanding general there, has been very supportive and very positive and listening to the issues. But beyond that, I feel like neglect is an appropriate word to use for the lab. And then a delay they've got a brand new $1.1 billion building that they've been promised to move into. They've been promising to move into since 2017, and it just isn't happening. So you get the young scientists that knew all about RID when it was the hot zone and when it was well known and loved. They join the staff, but they haven't been staying long in many cases because they come in now as a contractor, which wasn't the case in the past, and they find that it wasn't quite what they read about in Richard Preston's novel. The last two bullets on the uniform science career paths and building bio SMEs were right on target, I think, last summer when we were working on this report. I'm less convinced that we can do it today after watching what has happened in the last 6 months. So we'll probably talk about this later, but we proposed pre-pandemic this civilian director and uniform deputy option to try to stabilize the leadership in the organizations. I think if we did that, I believed then if we did that we could turn this around in a decade. I'm less sure now, and I can expand on that a little bit later.
Next chart, please, Katie. Dave, I don't want to go through all of these in depth because we're running out of time for questions. But why don't you talk a little bit about the importance of informal relationships, because you're probably the flagship case for how to do this right.
Yeah, I of course am involved in a lot of this internationally, but as I said, I think it's all about people and it's all about relationships in these organizations, much more important than the facilities or even the budget. And I think it's critical that our scientists develop domestic relationships, both with academia and industry, but also international relationships. We've seen that through the academies where we were building relationships, taking our coronavirus experts, Ralph Barrick from UNC and others with us on our China trip. So they know the key Chinese coronavirus scientists personally now. That's not the case with our scientists in SAMRID. So I think what has happened when the SME structure kind of breaks down and there aren't as many, you don't build as many domestic relationships or international networks as you did when you had really expert scientists in various areas, either by bug or by discipline, like pathology or immunology or vaccinology, when you had real experts in our service labs who would go to international meetings and build these relationships. And one of the things that has hurt this is the last 5 commanders have been there for 2 years only, come in with no lab experience, some good leaders, some great guys. But I think it takes 18 months to understand what's going on in a complex laboratory, and they only get to stay now for 2 years. So all of these factors brought together, as well as a lack of mentoring, because the organization is pulled apart. They're competing against one another, so mentoring has stopped. And all of these factors together have broken down the all-important relationships, both domestic and of course international.
Next chart, please, Katie. Let's see. Again, not going through the details here. We had a number of actions related to the actual things that need to be done. DoD has a role in all of these. A lot of these are directed to Charles Schwall's organization that is responsible. Next chart, please. But I do want to highlight one thing on this chart in particular, namely the cooperative engagement programs at DITRA that are, if you will, the successive generations to the original CTR program aimed at dismantling Russian nuclear weapons. They built a strong set of relationships internationally throughout the world in the public health and biosurveillance areas that is now under attack by the administration that proposed to dramatically decrease the funding in this area. Congress is actually, in bipartisan fashion, is seeking to restore the money, but that's a TBD based on what comes out of the committee discussions. Next two charts will finish up. So with all of that and that whole laundry list of things, you know, if you were going to do this soup to nuts, we said, how do you get started? We would start first with the posture review and do some key things with the program with staff reduction and setting up some sort of support for IRAD at the labs to get them going in some way to reignite the innovation that used to characterize them and hopefully attract some good people. And finally, the next chart, that there were some tactical things that could make a difference with assigning a key principal to coordinate all the interagency activities, to do something with the two medical labs, USAMRIID and ICD, that has been done at the lab formerly known as ECBC, Edgewood. That they have a civilian director and a military deputy, whereas the two medical labs have a military director that is there, as Dave said, for only 2 years, and a civilian deputy. We said, you know, we like the ECBC model. It's a rare example of excellence in this area, and you ought to think about adopting that, because that continuity of leadership by someone who's expert in the field really provides the attraction and the stability that scientific staff needs. And finally, a couple of things that build on fairly inexpensive sorts of things that are already going on. Really focus the early warning work at DARPA and DITRA. We saw examples of that to be able to better identify emerging areas of concern. And by God, just go buy Narcan at a few bucks a dose and keep it in stores so that you take fentanyl off the threat list as anything that anyone would dare use against our forces. or supporting functions. So with that, let us stop and let's, sorry we got a little long-winded, but let's take questions.
That was great. Thanks to both of you for very interesting presentations.